My name is Marilyn, and at 56 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of disrespect life could throw at me. I was wrong. The evening my son-in-law sat across from me at dinner, laughing with his parents in French, while they mocked everything about me, thinking I couldn't understand a word that was a new low. But here's what they didn't know. I had lived in Paris for 5 years. I spoke French fluently, and I heard every single insult. I just chose to stay silent, until I didn't. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were better than you, go ahead and hit that like button. And subscribe, because this story about how I taught my son-in-law and his family a lesson they'll never forget is one you won't want to miss. Now let me take you back to that evening when I discovered who my son-in-law really was. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, in the same house where my late husband David and I raised our daughter Charlotte. David passed away 5 years ago from a sudden stroke, and since then it's just been me and the memories we built together in these walls. Charlotte is my only child, my pride and joy, and at 28, she's everything I could have hoped for. Smart, kind, successful in her career as a marketing consultant. She met Philippe 2.5 years ago at the international consulting firm where she worked. Philippe was 32, born in France, but raised between Lyon and New York. He worked in finance, always impeccably dressed, always confident. When Charlotte first brought him home, I'll admit I was impressed. He was polite, successful, seemed to adore my daughter. But there was something about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. A certain distance, an air of superiority that made me slightly uncomfortable. They dated for 2 years before Philippe proposed during a trip to the French Riviera. Charlotte called me from Nice, crying happy tears, and I pushed my reservations aside. If my daughter was happy, that's all that mattered. They got married 3 months ago in a beautiful ceremony at the Boston Public Garden. Philippe's parents flew in from France for the wedding. Bernard and Colette Laurent. They were polite during the festivities, but I noticed the way Colette's eyes would sweep over me, assessing, judging. The way Bernard would nod curtly when I spoke, as if barely tolerating the conversation. What none of them knew, what I had never mentioned, because it simply never came up, was my past. You see, when I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in art history, I received a scholarship to study at the Sorbonne in Paris. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. I packed my bags and moved to the Marais district, into a tiny apartment on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator. I spent 5 years in that magical city. 5 years learning, growing, falling in love with French culture, and becoming fluent in the language. I worked part-time at a small art gallery in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. I spent my weekends at the Louvre, my evenings at cafes in the Latin Quarter. I learned to speak French, not just adequately, but beautifully, with the proper accent and all the nuances. That's where I met David. He was an American journalist stationed in Paris. We fell in love over espresso and croissants, married in a small ceremony at the town hall in the 6th arrondissement, and eventually moved back to the States when he got a job offer in Boston. I continued using my French for years, reading French literature, watching French films. But after David died, I retreated into myself. I didn't talk much about my past. Charlotte knew I had studied in Paris, but she was always so busy with her own life that we never really discussed the details. She certainly didn't know I was fluent, and Philippe and his parents. They had no idea whatsoever. It was mid-October when Philippe called to invite me to dinner. His parents were visiting from Lyon for 2 weeks. He wanted us all to have dinner together at his and Charlotte's penthouse in Back Bay. Charlotte was so excited when she called me separately. She wanted our families to bond, to become close. I could hear the hope in her voice. I arrived at their building on a crisp Friday evening, carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers. Their penthouse was stunning, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture. Bernard answered the door. He was tall, probably 6'2", with silver hair combed back perfectly. He wore a tailored navy suit, even though this was supposed to be a casual dinner. Colette appeared behind him, elegant in a cream-colored dress. Pearls at her throat. Her dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon. Diamonds glittered at her ears. Bernard shook my hand with a grip that was firm, but somehow felt dismissive. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Colette took the wine and flowers with a small nod, murmuring a thank you that sounded more obligatory than genuine. The air felt cold despite the warmth inside the apartment. Charlotte rushed over beautiful in a simple black dress, her face glowing with happiness. She hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm so glad you're here, Mom." Philippe stood by the kitchen counter, looking relaxed in slacks and a crisp white shirt. He greeted me with a kiss on each cheek, the French way, and gestured toward the dining table. The apartment smelled amazing, roasted chicken with herbs garlic butter, very French. We settled around the table, which was set with fine china and crystal glasses. The food was exquisite. Coq au vin perfectly prepared. Ratatouille that melted in your mouth. A selection of French cheeses that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. At first, the conversation was in English. Bernard asked about my background, where I grew up, what I did for work. I told them I had been an art teacher at an elementary school for 30 years before retiring 5 years ago. I saw something flicker in Colette's eyes. Not quite contempt, but close. A sort of dismissal, as if teaching children was beneath her consideration. Colette asked about my family, my heritage. I answered honestly. My parents were working-class people. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a secretary. I could feel them categorizing me, filing me away in some mental box labeled ordinary. The conversation felt less like getting to know me and more like an interrogation, an assessment of whether I was good enough to be connected to their family. After we finished the main course, something shifted. Bernard said something to Philippe in French, something about needing to call his brother in Lyon the next day. Philippe responded in French, and then Colette joined in. At first it was innocent enough. Just comments about family members back home, plans for the rest of their visit. Charlotte smiled awkwardly, understanding maybe one word in 10. She had taken a semester of French in college, but retained almost nothing. Philippe would occasionally translate a sentence or two for her, and she'd nod, trying to follow along. But then the tone changed. I was cutting into my chicken when I heard Bernard say, "Cette femme est très ordinaire." This woman is very ordinary. My fork paused halfway to my mouth, but I didn't look up. I kept chewing, kept my expression neutral. Colette responded, her voice light, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Oui, je ne comprends pas pourquoi Charlotte n'a pas choisi quelqu'un de notre classe." Yes, I don't understand why Charlotte didn't choose someone from our class. My heart started beating faster, but I forced myself to take a sip of wine to keep my face calm. Charlotte was asking Philippe something about dessert, oblivious to what his parents had just said about me. Philippe laughed a casual sound and replied to his mother in French. "Maman soit gentille. Mais oui, sa mère est un peu simple. Mom be nice. But yes, her mother is a bit simple." The word simple hung in the air. Simple. As if I were a simpleton. As if 30 years of teaching children to see beauty and creativity in the world made me somehow less than them. I reached for my water glass, took a slow drink. Under the table, my other hand gripped my napkin so hard my knuckles turned white. But my face remained pleasant, slightly smiling, as if I were enjoying the evening. Colette continued emboldened by the fact that I showed no reaction. Et cette robe qu'elle porte, très démodée. And that dress she's wearing, very outdated. I glanced down at my dress. It was a simple navy blue shift dress, nothing fancy, but clean and appropriate. I had thought I looked fine, apparently not by their standards. Bernard chuckled, actually chuckled, and added, Elle a l'air d'une vieille enseignante fatiguée. She looks like a tired old teacher. Philippe joined his father's laughter. Au moins Charlotte a du style. Dieu merci, elle ne ressemble pas à sa mère. At least Charlotte has style. Thank God she doesn't look like her mother. The three of them sat there smiling, laughing at me, while Charlotte remained completely unaware, scrolling through her phone to show Philippe something about their upcoming vacation plans. My throat felt tight. My eyes stung, but I absolutely refused to let tears form. Instead, I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood in their marble bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, staring at my reflection. Tired old teacher, simple, outdated. The words echoed in my head. But underneath the hurt, something else was building. Something cold and calculating. They thought I didn't understand. They felt safe mocking me right to my face because they assumed I was too ordinary, too simple, too American to know French. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When I returned to the table, Colette was pouring coffee. She smiled at me, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and made one more comment in French as she handed me a cup. J'espère que nos petits-enfants n'hériteront pas de ces gènes. I hope our grandchildren won't inherit her genes. That was it. That was the moment I decided exactly what I was going to do. I smiled back at her, thanked her in English for the coffee, and said nothing about understanding every venomous word she had spoken. The rest of the evening crawled by. They switched back to English, eventually making polite small talk. I participated just enough to seem normal, but inside my mind was racing. Planning. When I finally left around 10 o'clock, Charlotte hugged me goodnight and said she hoped I'd enjoyed meeting Philippe's parents properly. I told her it was lovely, kissed her cheek, and drove home through the dark Boston streets. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word they had said. Every laugh. Every dismissive glance. The hurt was real sharp and deep. But I refused to let it consume me. Instead, I channeled it into something more useful. By morning, I had made my decision. I would not confront them immediately. That would be too easy, too forgettable. They could deny it, claim I misunderstood, make Charlotte think I was being dramatic or paranoid. No, I needed something more strategic. Something that would make an impact they couldn't dismiss or explain away. I got up, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop. I started researching. Bernard Laurent Lyon Real Estate. It didn't take long to find information. He owned a small real estate development company. Not huge, not particularly prestigious, despite the way he carried himself. I dug deeper. Found articles from French business journals. And there it was. 10 years ago, Bernard's company had faced serious financial difficulties after a bad investment in a property development that fell through. They had lost most of their money. The family had been living on credit and the remnants of their former wealth ever since, maintaining appearances, but with very little actual substance behind them. Colette's background was similar. She had worked in fashion, but in minor roles, nothing significant. Yet they both acted as if they were French aristocracy. I sat back in my chair, a plan forming. But I needed more information. I needed someone on the ground in France. Someone who could verify what I was learning. I opened my old email contacts and found the name I was looking for. Geneviève Marchand. We had been close friends when I lived in Paris. She had gone on to become a journalist, now working for a regional newspaper in Lyon. We had exchanged Christmas cards over the years, but hadn't spoken in depth in a long time. I sent her an email, keeping it casual at first, asking how she was catching up. Then I mentioned I had a favor to ask. Did she know anything about the Laurent family? Bernard and Colette. Laurent Real Estate, former fashion industry. Genevieve replied within 24 hours. Her response made me smile. Oh, Marilyn the Laurents. Yes, I know of them. They're what we call faux bourgeois. All image, no substance. Bernard was involved in a minor scandal years ago, nearly got sued for misrepresenting a property deal. Colette borrowed money from several friends and never paid it back. They live well beyond their means. Why do you ask? I explained the situation. My daughter had married their son. They had insulted me in French, thinking I didn't understand. I was planning to teach them a lesson about respect. Genevieve's response was enthusiastic. Do it, and when you do, please tell me all about it. People like that need to be reminded that kindness and respect matter more than appearances. Armed with this information, I began writing. I opened a blank document and started composing a letter, in French, perfect, flawless French. I wrote about the dinner party. I quoted word for word every insult they had thrown at me. I described my 5 years in Paris, my degree from the Sorbonne, my fluency in their language. I mentioned delicately but clearly that I knew about their financial struggles, their false pretenses. I didn't threaten them directly. That would be crude. Instead, I simply stated facts and made it clear that if they continued to disrespect me, I would have no choice but to share the truth with Charlotte. Not just about what they said, but about who they really were. I revised the letter 3 times, making sure every word was perfect. The tone was polite but firm, respectful but unmistakably powerful. I printed it on high-quality paper, placed it in an elegant envelope, and sealed it. Then I waited. Charlotte called me 2 days after the dinner. She sounded happy, energetic. Mom, Philippe's parents said they really enjoyed meeting you. They want to have brunch with us next Sunday. Can you come? I could hear the hope in her voice. She so badly wanted everyone to get along. My heart ached for her innocence, her assumption that everyone was kind and genuine. Of course, sweetheart, I told her. I'd love to. Great. And Mom, I know they can seem a little formal, but they're really nice once you get to know them. I bit my tongue. I'm sure, I said. The week passed slowly. I went about my normal routine. Yoga class on Tuesday mornings, lunch with my book club on Wednesday, grocery shopping, gardening. But underneath the normalcy I was preparing. I bought a new outfit, a tailored pantsuit from a French designer boutique in Newbury Street. Elegant, expensive, nothing like the simple dress I had worn to dinner. I had my hair done professionally, styled in soft waves. I chose understated jewelry, pearl earrings, and a simple gold bracelet that had belonged to my mother. When I looked in the mirror on Sunday morning, I saw a woman who was polished, confident, and far from simple or outdated. I placed the envelope in my leather handbag and drove to Charlotte and Philippe's apartment. Sunday arrived with bright autumn sunshine. I drove through Boston feeling surprisingly calm. The envelope sat in my handbag like a small bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate. When I walked into the penthouse, I could see the surprise on Colette's face. Her eyes swept over my outfit, my hair, my overall appearance. She blinked clearly, not expecting this version of me. Bernard looked up from his newspaper, eyebrows rising slightly. Charlotte rushed over, beaming. Mom, you look amazing! Philippe appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of pastries. Bonjour, Marilyn, he said, kissing my cheeks again. I noticed his eyes linger on my suit, a small crease appearing between his brows. The brunch spread was beautiful. Quiche Lorraine, fresh croissants, fruit salad, smoked salmon, several types of jam. Charlotte had clearly gone to great effort. We settled around the table, and for the first 15 minutes, everything was pleasant enough. They talked about their plans to visit Harvard Yard, to walk the Freedom Trail. Bernard mentioned wanting to buy some books from the Harvard bookstore. Colette discussed Boston's shopping compared to Paris. I listened, contributed occasionally, and waited. Then, inevitably, they slipped into French again. Charlotte was in the kitchen refilling the coffee pot when Bernard leaned toward Colette and said in French, "Elle a fait un effort aujourd'hui." She made an effort today. Colette nodded, sipping her mimosa. Mais toujours aussi pathétique. But still just as pathetic. Philippe chuckled softly. They thought they were being discreet, speaking quietly. They had no idea I could hear every syllable. Bernard added, "Au moins elle a l'air mieux habillée aujourd'hui. Peut-être elle a emprunté les vêtements. At least she looks better dressed today. Maybe she borrowed the clothes. That did it." I reached into my handbag, pulled out the envelope, and set it on the table. Not dramatically, not with anger, just calmly placed it in front of my plate. Bernard glanced at it, confused. Colette looked at Philippe, who shrugged. I picked up my coffee cup, took a sip, and then said in perfect French, "C'est une lettre pour vous. Je pense que vous devriez la lire maintenant." The effect was instantaneous. Bernard's head snapped up. Colette's mouth fell open. Philippe's face went completely white. Charlotte came back from the kitchen. "Mom, you speak French." I turned to her, switching to English. "Yes, sweetheart. I lived in Paris for 5 years when I was young. I studied at the Sorbonne. I'm fluent." Charlotte's eyes widened. I had no idea. I looked back at Bernard and Colette, continuing in French. "J'ai tout entendu ce que vous avez dit l'autre soir. Et aujourd'hui aussi. Chaque mot. I heard everything you said the other night. And today too. Every word." Colette's hand trembled her mimosa glass, shaking. Vous comprenez parfaitement," I said calmly. "Et je me souviens de tout." Perfectly, and I remember everything. Bernard reached for the envelope with shaking hands. He opened it, pulled out the letter, and began reading. I watched the color drain from his face. Colette leaned over to read with him, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Philippe stood frozen, his expression one of absolute horror. Charlotte looked between all of us, confused and increasingly alarmed. "What's going on? Someone please tell me what's happening." I turned to my daughter, my voice gentle. "At the dinner last week, they mocked me in French. They called me ordinary, simple, a tired old teacher. They made fun of my dress. They said they hoped your children wouldn't inherit my genes." Philippe laughed along with them. Charlotte's face crumpled. She turned to Philippe. "Is this true?" Philippe opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I continued, still speaking to Charlotte. "In that letter I've written everything they said, word for word, in perfect French. I've also mentioned that I'm aware of their financial situation, their reputation in Lyon, the reality behind the image they project." Bernard stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is blackmail," he said in accented English, his voice shaking with rage and fear. I remained seated, composed. "No, Bernard. This is the truth. And if you ever disrespect me again, Charlotte will know everything. Not just about what you said, but about who you really are." Colette burst into tears. "Nous sommes désolés," she choked out in French. "We're sorry." I looked at her steadily. "Your apology means nothing if it comes from fear rather than genuine remorse." Charlotte stood up, her chair falling backward. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" she said to Philippe. "How could you let your parents talk about my mother like that? How could you join in?" Philippe finally found his voice. "Charlotte, please. It was stupid. It was thoughtless. We didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Charlotte's voice rose. "You didn't mean for her to understand. You didn't mean to get caught. Which part didn't you mean?" The room fell into terrible silence. The only sound was Colette's quiet crying and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Bernard slowly sat back down, the letter still gripped in his hand. His face had gone from red with anger to grey with shock. Colette pressed a napkin to her eyes, her elegant composure completely shattered. Philippe stood motionless, staring at Charlotte, who had backed away from him, wrapping her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. I remained calm, sitting with my hands folded in my lap, watching them all process what had just happened. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this. But mostly, I felt strong. For the first time since that awful dinner, I felt powerful instead of hurt. Bernard cleared his throat. He looked at the letter again, then at me. When he spoke, his voice was strained. "Mrs. Thompson, we apologize. We were wrong." "You were more than wrong," I said quietly. "You were cruel, and you did it because you thought you could get away with it, because you thought I was too simple, too ordinary, too beneath you to understand." Colette wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Charlotte walked over to me, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have known something was wrong. I should have protected you." I covered her hand with mine. "You didn't know, sweetheart. You couldn't have known. They made sure of that." She turned to Philippe's parents, her voice shaking but firm. "I want you to leave, now." Bernard stood up immediately. "Charlotte, please let us explain." "There's nothing to explain," Charlotte said. "You came into my home, ate my food, and insulted my mother to her face because you thought she was too stupid to understand. There's no explanation that makes that acceptable." Colette gathered her purse with trembling hands. "We truly are sorry," she whispered. "Sorry you got caught," I said quietly. "Not sorry for what you did." They moved toward the door. Bernard paused, looking back at me. For a moment I saw genuine shame in his eyes. "You are right," he said slowly in English. "We judged you unfairly. We thought ourselves better. We were wrong." "Yes," I said simply. "You were." They left. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Charlotte immediately turned to Philippe. "We need to talk, right now." Philippe nodded, looking smaller, somehow, diminished. "I know, Charlotte, Don't," she held up a hand. "Not here, not in front of my mother. You've already humiliated her enough." I stood up, smoothing down my suit. "I should go." "No, Mom, you don't have to." "I do," I said gently. "You two need to have a conversation that I shouldn't be part of. But Charlotte, remember this. You deserve someone who respects you, who respects your family, who doesn't think he's better than the people who raised you." Charlotte hugged me tight, and I could feel her shaking. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself." "I love you too, sweetheart." I looked at Philippe. He couldn't meet my eyes. "If you want to be worthy of my daughter," I said, "you have a lot of work to do, starting with figuring out who you really are without your parents' pretensions." He nodded mutely. I left them there and drove home feeling exhausted, but somehow lighter than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, Bernard and Colette changed their return flight and went back to France a week earlier than planned. I received a formal letter from them, a written apology in both French and English, acknowledging their behavior and expressing shame for their actions. Charlotte called me every day. She and Philippe were in counseling, working through the breach of trust. She told me Philippe was genuinely trying to understand why he had behaved that way, why he had let his parents' values become his own. A week after the brunch, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Philippe standing there holding a bouquet of white roses. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside, letting him enter. We sat in my living room, the same room where Charlotte had played as a child, where David and I had celebrated anniversaries and Christmases. Philippe sat on the edge of the sofa, turning his hat in his hands. "I don't have an excuse," he began. "What I did, what I allowed my parents to do, was inexcusable. I let you sit there while we mocked you, and I laughed. I participated." I waited, letting him continue. "I grew up believing that certain things mattered: status, image, being part of the right circles. My parents raised me to think that's what made someone worthy. But you showed me how empty that all is. You have more dignity, more strength, more class than my parents have ever had, and I was too blind to see it." "Philippe," I said, "I don't need your parents to like me. I don't need them to think I'm good enough for their family. But Charlotte does need a husband who won't let anyone, not even his own parents, disrespect the people she loves." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been thinking a lot about who I am, who I want to be. Charlotte deserves better than what I've shown her. You both do." "Then be better," I said simply. "Not for me, for her, and for yourself." He nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. "I'm trying, I really am." I believed him. Whether he would succeed, only time would tell. But I saw something in his face that gave me hope. Real remorse. Real determination to change. After he left, I sat in my quiet house and thought about everything that had happened. About respect and dignity, and the quiet power of knowing your own worth. The months that followed brought changes I hadn't expected. Philippe threw himself into becoming a better person, a better husband. He started reading books about humility and empathy. He volunteered at a community center in a less affluent neighborhood, teaching financial literacy to families who needed help managing their money. He stopped talking about status and started talking about character. Charlotte watched these changes carefully, hopefully. She told me that in their counseling sessions, Philippe had broken down crying, realizing how much of his identity had been built on his parents' shallow values rather than anything real or meaningful. Bernard and Colette sent another letter this time, longer and more personal. They wrote about their own insecurities, their fear of losing status after their financial troubles, their desperate need to feel superior to others to mask their own sense of failure. They didn't excuse their behavior, but they tried to explain it. And they asked humbly if someday I might forgive them. I wrote back. I told them that forgiveness was possible, but trust would take time. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with their future grandchildren, they would need to learn that kindness mattered more than appearances, that treating people with respect wasn't optional, and that true class had nothing to do with money or social standing. Charlotte and I grew closer than we had been in years. She wanted to know everything about my time in Paris. I pulled out old photo albums I hadn't looked at in decades. Pictures of me at 25 sitting at a cafe in Montmartre, young and hopeful. Images of the gallery where I worked, the friends I made, the life I lived, before I became a wife and mother. "You were so brave, Mom," Charlotte said, looking at a photo of me standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. "Moving to a foreign country alone, learning a new language, building a whole life there." I didn't feel brave at the time, I admitted. I just felt excited and terrified and alive. We started taking a French conversation class together, mother and daughter. It was Charlotte's idea. She wanted to reclaim that part of her heritage, to connect with the language and culture that had meant so much to me. One evening, about 4 months after the brunch incident, Philippe invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. Charlotte encouraged me to go. We met at a small French bistro in Cambridge. Philippe stood when I arrived, pulled out my chair, waited until I was seated, before sitting down himself. Small courtesies, but they mattered. Over coq au vin, ironically, he told me about his journey. I called my parents and told them I wouldn't be speaking to them for a while, he said. Not out of anger, but because I needed distance to figure out who I am without their voices in my head. How did they take it? Not well at first, but then my father called back and said he understood. He said maybe he needed to do the same thing to examine his own values and choices. We talked for 2 hours about family, about marriage, about what it means to be a good person. As we were leaving, Philippe said, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm grateful. What you did, exposing the truth, it was the wake-up call I needed." "I didn't do it for you," I said honestly. "I did it for me, and for Charlotte. I know, but I'm grateful anyway." By the time spring arrived, bringing green leaves and warm sunshine back to Boston, things had settled into a new normal. Philippe's relationship with his parents remained strained, but was slowly improving as all three of them worked on changing their attitudes and behaviors. Charlotte and Philippe's marriage grew stronger, built now on honesty and mutual respect rather than surface compatibility. As for me, I discovered something unexpected. Standing up for myself, refusing to be diminished or dismissed, had awakened something in me. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since David died. I joined a French conversation group at the public library. I even planned a trip back to Paris, my first time returning in over 20 years. One Saturday afternoon, Charlotte and Philippe came over for lunch. As we sat in my garden eating sandwiches and drinking lemonade, Charlotte said, "Mom, I've been thinking, when you and I go to Paris this summer, I want to see all the places that were important to you. Your old apartment, the gallery, the cafes you loved. I want to know that part of you." I smiled, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "I'd like that." Philippe cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson." "Marilyn, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "My parents want to visit again. They want a chance to apologize in person to try to start over. But they'll only come if you're comfortable with it. They don't want to impose or cause you any stress." I considered this. 6 months ago, the answer would have been an immediate no, but time and genuine effort had softened my stance. "Tell them they can come, but tell them this too. I expect respect, I expect courtesy, and I expect them to treat everyone they meet, regardless of background or status, with basic human dignity. If they can commit to that, then yes, they can visit." Philippe nodded, relief evident on his face. "Thank you. They will. I promise they will." They thought I was just a simple old teacher who didn't understand their world. But I understood perfectly. I understood their insecurities, their need to put others down to feel better about themselves, their hollow values. And when the time was right, I showed them exactly who I was. I showed them that speaking multiple languages isn't about showing off. It's about understanding the world. That living modestly doesn't mean living small. That teaching children is one of the most important jobs anyone can do. That real class has nothing to do with money or connections, and everything to do with how you treat people when you think no one is watching. The look on their faces when I started speaking French, when I slid that envelope across the table, that's something I'll remember forever. Not because I enjoyed their discomfort, but because it represented a moment of truth. A moment when pretense crumbled and reality had to be faced. Respect isn't something you can demand based on your bank account or your family name or where you went to school. Respect is earned through kindness, through integrity, through treating others the way you want to be treated yourself. That's a lesson Bernard and Colette Laurent learned the hard way. And honestly, it's a lesson we all need to remember. I'm 56 years old now. I've lived through loss and joy, heartbreak and triumph. I've learned that staying silent isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's strength. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for exactly the right moment to show people who you really are. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were better than you? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a way that completely changed how people saw you? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you to value yourself and demand respect, please hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about real people facing real challenges with courage and dignity. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're worth standing up for, that they deserve respect, that being underestimated doesn't mean you have to stay quiet forever. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. I hope it encourages you to know your worth, to use your voice when it matters, and to never let anyone make you feel small. May you always have the courage to stand in your truth, and may you surround yourself with people who see your value and treat you accordingly. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.